Good afternoon, and welcome to Virtual Book Passage. We are with Barbara McHugh. Barbara McHugh is the author of Bride of the Buddha. Thunderous applause now.
Okay.
Barbara McHugh has a PhD in religion and literature from the Graduate Theological Union and the University of California at Berkeley. She's traveled to India a number of times. She's been seriously meditating and studying Buddhism since the mid-'80s. She has been teaching introductory meditation and Buddhism courses since 2003. She's been co-leading a twice-monthly meditation group since 2008, and she's been on the Marin Sangha Board of Directors since 2013. She is joined by her good friend, Dorothy Edwards. Dorothy is the author of Langston's Moon, a children's story about an African-American family. Currently, Dot is working on a novel set in the Caribbean and a nonfiction book about imagination. So I think we're ready to begin.
Oh, and the disembodied voice belongs to my husband, Bill, who's technical advisor here. And there he is. All right, so we begin.
Okay, let's go. Oh, okay, Barbara. This book, the cover, I'm telling you, is absolutely gorgeous. And it isn't half as beautiful as the book itself. It's an absolutely glorious, wonderful book. And can you tell us, first of all, what the book is about, The Bride of Buddha? Because I didn't know Buddha had a bride before reading your book.
The book indeed is about the Buddha's wife, whom he abandoned when he went to go seek enlightenment. He abandoned her with their infant son. And in my book, she has her own spiritual journey, which starts in her childhood and eventually leads to her disguising her gender to join the Buddhist community, which does not admit women at the time. And she becomes eventually the Buddhist attendant and closest confidant. And historically, Ananda, and that's who she becomes, is the monk who persuades the Buddha to allow women to join the order.
Okay, so then the book is about the wife's journey to become enlightened or to become part of this movement. And in doing so, she assumes the role of Ananda as she enters this. That's what you're telling us?
That's what I'm telling you. So I'll read from the prologue, which sort of sets up the story.
Okay.
I won't leave without your blessing. Siddhartha whispered so softly that I wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. He stood in the carved rosewood doorway of our bedchamber, and in the deepening silence of my refusal, I pulled Rahula closer, praying that our 2-day-old son would feel only the beating of my heart and not the bitterness that filled it. You don't need my blessing. Just go, find your Dharma. My young husband, who would one day be called the Buddha, didn't move. He stood in the darkness across the room from our wedding bed, and I lay on my side with my back to him, staring out the window at a moon waning to a diamond white crescent. A single star, sharp as betrayal, was poised beside it. It was just before dawn. Rahula stirred against my collarbone, a small shifting warmth under the cool silk coverlet. My husband had named him Rahula, the common word for bond, but it also meant fetter. Yasi, he said, if you ask me to stay, I will. I looked at him, still standing in the doorway, but he was only a silhouette, his clear eyes and the tender curve of his lips already fading in my memory. Perhaps if I'd seen his face and it had revealed a change, I would have begged him to stay. But in recent months, his look of sadness and revulsion at the sight of my mortal flesh and all the suffering it implied, had lodged in my soul. And now all I could think of was that look. I won't change your plans, I said. You're right to cast off your illusions. I only wish you'd done it before we married. I gazed at the rising crescent moon, soon to be effaced by morning sunlight. Already there was a green smear in the east. My husband spoke one last time. I promise if I find the truth, I'll bring it home to you and Mahula. I doubted his words. A minute went by, then another. Finally, the breeze shifted and the crickets resumed their refrain. Siddhartha had left as I knew he would. He was taking the journey I'd once intended for myself. Supposedly the moon was full the night he left. Supposedly I slept through it all. My version of these events will not be the one told to future generations. I was all but banished from that story. It's the price I had to pay for the life I chose.
Wow, that's powerful. To think of a husband leaving his wife with a 2-day-old baby. Wow. It seems that's quite startling. How did you get the idea to write this book?
Well, that's what you just said, basically. I knew of many women who were really turned off by the idea of joining a religion whose founder had, deserted his wife and baby. Although, to say the wife and baby were well cared for. It wasn't that he was banning them on a road or something. But it was a question for a lot of women. It was a question for me when I first started. What's going on here? And so I wanted to explore that story. And is this myth necessary? And can it be justified? And what are the motivations? Can they be made palatable? So just to fill anyone in on the basic myth, if you don't know it, the Buddha's father, when the Buddha was a baby, was told by a holy man or a prophet that his son would become either a world-turning monarch or a great holy man. Well, Dad wanted the holy man. I mean, Dad wanted the king. He did not want the holy man. So he decided he would give his son the ideal worldly life. And he set him up in palaces with music and art and gardens and great food, and protected him from all signs of sickness and death. Again, this is the myth. The prince in a palace myth is really a myth. The Buddha actually historically was a son of a clan leader, and there were clans in North India. They were called clan republics. They were kind of oligarchies. And so he was well off, but he was not a prince in a palace. But in the myth, he is a prince in a palace. And he did not face or see any signs of death until he was 29 years old, according to this myth. And he then came upon a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a holy man. Well, the first three devastated him. Suddenly, to be confronted with death at this stage of his life made his life completely meaningless and terrible. But the holy man was the inspiration. The only way he could solve this existential dilemma was to go on the road and become a holy man, become a holy wanderer, and look for enlightenment. And that was something that at the time people were doing. It was an age, they call it an axial age in Buddhism, not only in Buddhism, but in all that, in India, in the Middle East, in Greece, all of these countries were going through this kind of identity crisis where people had suddenly lost the confidence in their gods and in their lives. And so this was something that was considered a heroic trip to go off and be a holy man. But the monarchs still wanted to be kings, and the Buddha's father really didn't want that to happen. So, part of his leaving then entailed that he left his wife and child. And why would this have to be part of the myth? Why couldn't he have just sort of been this wastrel, gets just disillusioned with one more hangover and takes off and becomes a holy man. Why do we have to have him desert his wife and child? Well, my feeling about the myth is that it portrays the ideal worldly life. In other words, you have a deep, committed love with someone you care about. You have a child, which in a patriarchy is, a son is, the apex of the kind of life you would want to lead. And I think for the Buddha, who discovers that his main insight is life entails suffering, no matter how great your life is, it was important for him to have been leading the greatest life possible. So he left his wife, in a way, he left his wife for the sake of the myth. But then I'm left with the wife, she's just going to serve the myth, or is she going to actually be something that I can think about? So that's what got me thinking about her story and wanting to see the whole story from her point of view. I also wanted to do what a lot of women writers are doing right now, which are, writing from a female point of view, historical women, and giving us women sort of a primary place in the human dialogue, in the human emotion. We're not just some sort of side act. Women are at the center, and the same as men. I call giving women the status of being a default person. In other words, when you think of a person, you don't automatically think of a man. You don't think of any gender. So anyway, that was sort of where I really wanted to go with the story, that would somehow create the confidence so that we can characterize ourselves by our gender without defining ourselves by our gender. So that was
Right.
what I wrote.
Okay, so women can be the hero of the story and can go on the hero's quest and journey in the same way that
Right.
Odysseus does, or somebody. We can be the hero too. Okay, so how did you do the research for this? Because I understand this whole thing starts with an oral tradition, right?
Right. Well,
this whole story, yeah.
It does, yes. I just say, first off, my own practice was a sort of research. I couldn't really have written this book without being immersed in Buddhism as long as I was. I went on, for 20 years, I went on 2 to 3 residential retreats a year. And I've done a lot of meditating and other Buddhist practices. So that gave me sort of the insight into a lot of her meditative experiences and where she was going to have to go spiritually. But you mentioned, yes, I used the Pali Canon, which is the oldest body of Buddhist scriptures. A lot of it is, I think all of it by now is translated into English. Obviously, I use English translations. I don't know Pali. I'm not that much of a scholar, but I did use translations, and they were orally transmitted after the Buddha's death, which was, the official date is 483 BC, but that's somewhat arbitrary, and now it's controversial as well. But give or take 50, 100 years or so. Anyway, it was written down, the canon itself wasn't written down until the 1st century BC. But many stories from in my novel come from that canon. And I actually took a 2-year course in one of the canon's main compilations, which is the Majjhima Nikaya, which has a lot of stories. A lot of the canons are huge. Hold them up. They're this wide. There are thousands of pages, each one. And they have a lot of doctrine and meditation exercises. They're very repetitive, but the stories are they're in there. Some of them are sort of squeezed in, and others are just told as part of a dialogue or something like that. Besides the Pali Canon, I used a lot of scholarly commentaries and histories of the time. People like Richard Gombrich, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Stephen Batchelor, Karen Armstrong. I sat a retreat run by the Venerable Analayo, who's a very thorough scholar, an amazing scholar in Buddhism. And so I got a sense of the times and what the issues were back then in Buddhism and what the issues are now and some of the conflicts. that provided material for my novel. What's going on, or what are the different doctrinal conflicts happening here? And so that was very helpful too. And just the culture, the other religions at the time, and the types of wanderers and what, the holy wanderers and who they were and what they were talking about. And I also traveled in India. So I've been to India 4 times. In the 70s, I was there for 4 months, pretty much by myself, staying in ashrams and traveling around North India. And I planned to do a tour of the Buddhist sites in the 2000s, 5 years ago or so, when I was in the midst of writing this book. And unfortunately, Bill was hospitalized the week before we were going to go. So I didn't do the formal tour, but I got a real sense of I used my memories and my real sense of what India was like, the climate, the people. They're still the wandering holy people. And there's the spiritual questing, and it's an amazing place. And I was glad to be able to use my imagination and immerse myself in the memories I had, because I traveled in India in the 90s and in the aughts. So it wasn't only back in the 70s. And then finally, I went into the internet and found a lot of the legendary material and the post-canonic material that supplied me with other stories for the book.
Well, that is 4 trips to India, it seemed, and the internet covers it all too. Covers a lot. So you're quite a scholar. What were some of the challenges that you faced in writing this book?
Well, one of the big ones was the inconsistencies in the Pali texts and in the traditional material, and then trying to depict, the underlying truth underneath the contradictions. So that's always a challenge. And some of them were more mechanical than others, like Ananda's age, for instance. Some people say that Ananda and the Buddha were born on the same day. And other people say that Ananda was born on the day of the Buddha's enlightenment. Well, that's a 35-year difference. And actually, both of those ages are pretty impossible in terms of how the rest of the canon goes, because the Buddha treats Ananda as a much younger man. So for him to be born the same day as the Buddha seems strange. And Ananda became the Buddha's attendant later in the Buddha's life. So he had to be sort of helping the Buddha as an old man. The Buddha lived to be 80 years old. And toward the end of his life, he had a lot of physical problems. So the same day thing didn't really work, but the 35-year difference would have meant that when Ananda got around to trying to convince the Buddha to accept women into the Sangha, he would have been 5 years old. So that didn't really work either. So I had to figure out a compromise for that. But it's also interesting, in that tradition, eminent people are often described as being born on the same day. Like the Buddha's chief disciples, Moggallana and Sariputta, were considered to be born the same day. And actually, Buddha and Yasodhara, his wife, in some texts, are considered to be born the same day. I also didn't use that. Another contradiction or inconsistency I found, more of a contradiction and an inconsistency, was the misogynist material in the canon, because it's not consistent with the Buddha's attitudes or the Dharma. But you'll find, there are descriptions of women as snakes, foul, deception, all the usual insults, and of scant wisdom, which always sort of makes me bristle, because Jack Kerouac actually uses it as a quote in one of his novels describing the life of the Buddha. And he doesn't use it ironically or critically, he just attributes that to the Buddha. But actually, the Buddha, its basic teachings are not gender specific. And the Buddha's behavior certainly it's not consistent with these attitudes. I mean, he always believed that that women could be enlightened. even before he admitted them into the Sangha. And he also, after they were admitted into the Sangha, he encouraged them to teach and he praised their teachings. So these weird misogynistic remarks, where are they coming from? Also, in the early canon, there's a very powerful writings by enlightened women. So this is another example of the vast majority, I mean, the vast proportion of Buddhism is not misogynistic. And scholars these days tend to agree that a lot of these misogynistic remarks were added later. You know, some monk with a grudge fitting it into the program.
So as an author of fiction, historical fiction, you have some license to make some compromises or to make these inconsistencies work out some kind of way. So how did you do it in this case?
Well,
or in these cases?
Right. Well, some of the kind of silly inconsistencies, like there's one story of how the Yasodhara was pregnant for 6 years. The whole time Buddha was off enlightening, being enlightened, Yasodhara was pregnant. And I have my Yasodhara narrator just dismissed this as rumor, and some of the other remarks as gossip. And remarks that are sometimes attributed to the Buddha, the Yasodhara says, people say that the Buddha said this, but actually it was Devadatta, which is another monk who's clearly misogynistic in the novel. Sometimes I compromise, as with Ananda's age. I ended up with a 10-year difference. I made the Buddha 10 years older.
Well, I think for someone to say that a woman had a 6-year pregnancy, that would have to be a man.
Right.
That story. I can't see a woman coming up with that.
Right. But also what I had her do, I had Yasi/Ananda confront these misogynists and deal with them. And that's part of the story.
Yes. Yes. When you were researching, it seems like coming across, or you probably already knew about this 6-year pregnancy thing, but were there any surprises that you had while researching the book?
Well, certainly I had some surprises about Yasodhara. The name, that Yasodhara name, doesn't appear in the Pali Canon, and she appears very, very rarely in the canon. After she gives her son over to the Buddha, to become a monk, she's never mentioned again. She just sort of pushes her son forth and says, go to your father and get your inheritance. And then we don't hear from Yasodhara again. So she's kind of a blank slate, which was a challenge, but also was interesting. I mean, these other stories, I'd always assumed, that she was enlightened and she joined the Sangha because those stories are floating around. But actually in the Pali Canon, she's not. So that sort of made me, that was surprising. A lot of the material about Ananda, I was really surprised about, to some extent, that he really did support women, even beyond persuading the Buddha to admit them, and that he had a struggle with a lot of other monks because of this, and with their ascetics. And in fact, his struggle with the first patriarch of the Buddha, Mahakassapa, culminated in a trial. At least in my book, it culminates in a trial. For Ananda, has to go on trial to get into the final council, and he has to answer all these charges, many of which has to do with his attitude toward women. So that surprised me. I had no idea that was part of the canon. Also, the whole revolution, the revelation of monks not getting along. I mean, there's this vision of I think a lot of Buddhists, all the monks were enlightened around the Buddha. It was all perfect and lovely. But in fact, once the Buddha left the community for 3 months just to get away from the quarreling monks. So there was obviously some dissonance in the.
Well, all of that controversy and quarreling is just grist for the author's mill. You got to have conflict, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like this leads to, did this this Ananda, the personality of Ananda, did that lead you to the, not spoiler alert, the gender disguise?
Uh, yes, originally I didn't want to do that, and it was like I was compelled. It was at a certain point, he says, well, I got to do this. I had a requirement that the Buddha's wife, or my female heroine, was going to play a major part in the Buddha's life and in Buddhism. But the story of Yasadara is fairly bare bones. But then I learned these things about Ananda, that he persuaded women to admit women, persuaded the Buddha to admit women to the Sangha, and his support for women in other ways. Like he encouraged their participation in the Buddhist funeral rites, and he really got in trouble with the conservatives then. But also there were some anomalies about Ananda that really are difficult to explain. But one explanation would be that he and Yasadara could be the same person. And
Oh.
one of the anomalies is the Buddha was not enlightened Ananda was not enlightened till after the Buddha's death. Now, this is really strange because the Sangha, yes, there were quarreling monks, but supposedly the Buddha's closest associates were all enlightened. In fact, there was even an enlightened monk in there who'd been a mass murderer. And he'd killed almost 100 people, and he wore their fingers around his neck in a necklace. This was before he joined the Sangha, but he became enlightened. So here's this very kind monk who is not enlightened until after the Buddha died. That was very strange to me. And then anomaly number 2, this unenlightened monk persuades the Buddha to take on women in his community, which is a major policy decision. A junior unenlightened monk sort of giving arguments that surely the Buddha must have thought of himself. So I thought, this is strange, but if they were the same person, I could see how this would work. He'd be unenlightened for one reason, because he'd be living a life of deception. Also, very interestingly, Ananda and Yasadara are both often noted for their physical attractiveness, which is more interesting in the case of Ananda. But again, wow, they could be the same person. And also, then as a theme, Ananda embodied the compassionate, loving aspect of Buddhism. And the Buddha actually says as much. He says, you embody kindness. And I knew then that I could use this trope to dramatize the basic conflict that I wanted to portray in the novel.
Okay, so now just to boil it down to what the basic theme of the novel is, what would you say the basic theme is?
You could look at the basic theme as the conflict between loving the world. Can I love the world and the individuals in it? At the same time, can I transcend the world? How does this work? And I think most religions have these two poles. I mean, look at Jesus. These are not my mother and my brothers. At times he will talk very he doesn't seem to be into personal love in the least. And so it happens in Buddhism very strongly. And I use the story of Yasadara's relationship with her son to dramatize her dilemma. Because here's this mother who has this love for this individual, and yet she needs to embody impersonal, universal love and transcend, her individual life. And also the same theme with the conflicts between the monks and the conflicts with the ascetics, who are saying, give up the world. The world is dirt under my feet. And there's a very strong asceticism in Buddhism, although the chief ascetics left the Sangha, and the Buddha drew the line. But this conflict, I think, is a really important one. And certainly in my own life, it's a dilemma, and it's one of those conflicts that I can't come down on either side of. I sort of live it day by day, and there's a quote that Buddhists love to, Western Buddhists anyway, love to quote by Maharaj. And I sort of use a version of this quote, which is, wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I am everything. My life is a river that flows between the two. And that sort of, for me, sort of expresses that conflict.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it does express the conflict though. Now you have, since it's a work of fiction, and to round out the full story, you have purely fictional characters and aspects of the plot, such as Yassi's brother and the tribal people. So how did you work that into the story, or why?
Well, why I think I needed people to represent aspects of the times and the values that persist to this day. And, you know, one of them is misogyny, sort of an anti-value. And so I had her, Yassi's brother, sort of embody this misogyny. And he functions really as an antagonist throughout the novel, but he's a fictional character. I'm sure that the Buddha's wife had siblings, or it would seem logical that she would, but I don't know anything about them, and I don't know if they're ever mentioned. So I made them up, and I used them in the plot. And then the tribal people, I wanted the shamanistic viewpoint represented in the novel. The vision not only of earthly love, human individuals, but love of nature, love of animals, that whole worldview. I wanted to explore it, and I wanted my characters to explore it. And the people I wrote about are very based very loosely on the Khand people, which actually may have been the hill people mentioned in the various ancient Buddhist texts. They practiced animism, and women reputedly had rights and powers, although the tribe was patrilineal. But it was an interesting group of people, and they actually survived today, and they're still fighting for their land. But I used them, as I said, I based them very loosely on them, and used them to give that dimension to the novel.
Now you mentioned that, well, you knew nothing about the siblings of Yassi, but you have the brother, the brother, and you actually have two sisters in the story, if I remember correctly. And one of the sisters dies as a young child.
Right, yeah.
And Yassi is very much affected by that. And I thought that part of the story in reading your manuscript was really beautiful and well described. And I was wondering, could you read us a little portion of that section, or do you have that available?
I just happen to have
I think
it
that
here.
was the charnel. You just happen to have it. Good. So when I'm thinking of the part after the sister dies, and Yassi as a child goes to find her sister.
Right. Yes. She's
in the charnel grounds. Yes.
She's convinced that her sister's not dead, and so she decides she's got to go rescue her. And obviously, she needs to do this without her family knowing.
And how old is Yassi at this time? At the time that she goes to the charnel ground?
She's 10 years old, and her sister was 7.
Yes, and her sister had fallen out of a tree.
Right,
and that she and Yassi felt that it was her fault that her sister fell.
Yeah, so that adds to the desperation she feels when she goes to the charnel ground.
Right.
The night after Deepa's funeral, the moon, 3 days past full, rose late, but well before midnight. I slept in the same room as my 3 older sisters, and now I had to wait for their steady breathing and little snores before I could start my journey. As I crept down the wooden stairs to the side entrance, the air was sour and weighed down with stale incense from the previous day. And I kept thinking of my mother's description of the charnel ground after dark, foul and slithering with ghosts mourning their lost flesh and driving living beings mad with fright. But when I opened the door to outside, the fresh night atmosphere braced my spirit and pushed away my fears. To the east of our family compound, the lopsided moon was big and yellow. Although its light was still weak, it sufficed, so I wouldn't need to steal a lamp. All I took with me was one of my own saris to wrap Deepa in so she wouldn't have to return home naked. I wore my dark blue day shift, which would be easier to run in if necessary. The windless night, cool in contrast to the dead air inside our house, seemed to heat up as I made my way to the packed dirt road that went around our village, a cluster of 12 2- and 3-story wooden dwellings and 30 straw and wattle huts. A few scattered lamps glimmered faltering yellow light. The entire village looked to be asleep. Not that I walked in silence. Frogs and crickets clamored and dogs barked, echoing through fields of freshly sown millet, mist gray in the light of the rising moon. I was glad for the creature's noise. It would mask any sounds I might make. As I walked along the empty road, my fear, which I tried to ignore, began to swell up, tightening my chest and making it hard to place one foot ahead of the other. I reminded myself I'd never seen a ghost, unlike almost everyone I knew, so I wasn't afraid of them. After all, these roving spirits never did anything. Still, anxiety sped up my mind, spinning off new problems. I had to face the possibility that Deepa really was dead, or that she died when they brought her to this terrible place. If so, I would have to beg her spirit to return to her body. I'd try to reason with it. What good was a spirit without a body? And if her soul was hurrying off to another life, did it really think it could find one better than Deepa's? We had a wealthy father, a loving mother, beautiful sisters, a house full of servants, a brave older brother dedicated to protecting us. Deepa's spirit could end up inside a dog, especially considering that recently we'd made fun of one of those wandering ascetics who imitated dogs as a way to purify his soul. What if our heedless play created bad karma, which forced Deepa into the animal realm? By the time I approached my destination, the moon was shining in my face, making it impossible at first to make out the bodies and bones, except for dark patches and faint white shapes. The voices of the little night creatures echoed ominously in the stillness, but at least the vultures were gone. I increased my pace, as if I could leave my trepidation behind. Then I hit a wall of stench that knocked me to my knees. The other times I'd seen the charnel ground from a distance, and it had been downwind. Tonight there was no wind at all. I held my nose, but the smell leaked in, a combination of feces and decaying flesh, yet worse. It had an ultimacy about it, as if it were the source of every foul odor in the world, warning me to run from it as far and as fast as possible. I staggered to my feet and forced myself forward. I had yet to arrive at the charnel ground proper. Deepa, I cried out, hoping she would come to me and we could both flee this wretched stench. But all I did was momentarily silence the crickets. I kept walking, gagging with every step, so preoccupied with the odor that I didn't realize I'd reached the grounds until I'd almost walked into the bloated corpse. Its huge, pale face inflated almost to bursting, the mouth a writhing ball of worms, black excrement for eyes. At this point, my body heaved and the smell of my own vomit knifed up through my viscera. It actually provided relief from the smell of death, but not from the horror pounding through my veins as I stumbled up the slope, the sickening crunch of rotting bones under my feet. Now on the charnel hill, I could see well enough, and it was horrible. I had to get Deepa out of here, but where was she? I dodged an armless skeleton and another naked corpse, this one face down, arms and legs flung out at impossible angles, as if the body had been tossed carelessly from above. Where were the spirits? By now I was in the center of the field, the moonlight turning the corpses a glistening gray and the bones chalk white. Deepa, I called out again and again. I screamed when I almost stepped on what once had been a baby, its head little more than a mashed piece of fruit, its mouth an empty hole in the center of its face. Reflexively, I looked up. Surely the spirit of such a little one would still be hovering above its body, unsure where to go. Then I realized there were no ghosts, no souls, only people who had turned into things. These things were far more awful than mere objects, more soulless than something that hadn't had a soul to begin with. They seemed to deny the very possibility of souls, not to mention life itself and the warmth and vibrancy of love. Far better to be haunted by armies of roving spirits, even demon spirits, than to have the image of these corpses settled in my heart. But now they had, forever. A shapeless new fear lurched up inside me, one I couldn't articulate at the time and didn't want to in any case. Cold sweat sliming my body, I kept on. These things were not Deepa. Deepa was alive and trapped here, and only I could save her. I broke into a run, passing a heap of skulls, trying to make out her shape on the slanting moonlit ground. Deepa! Then, praise be to the Devas, I saw her familiar form, silver pale in the moonlight, up the slope just 2 or 3 body lengths away. The vultures hadn't touched her. Why would they? She was alive, lying much as she had on the plank behind our altar. I started toward her, but a sudden sound made me stop. My engrossment with the smell and the sight of the corpses, plus the bleat of crickets, had prevented me from hearing the other noises all around me. The sounds of feeding. Wild dogs, a good 30 of them, had spread out over the field singly and in groups, growling and gulping as they fought over the gore. I could see them clearly now, gaunt and ragged-eared, snarling and snapping with jagged rows of teeth polished white by moonlight and their greedy saliva. One of them was headed toward Deepa. I broke into a run and reached her first, throwing my sari over her and snatching her up. She was heavy as stone and oddly stiff. From fear, I told myself, but I had no time to think about this. Staggering under her weight, I backed away from the dog, which was almost as tall as I was, only to have another one join it. They crouched down, one black, one a scruffy gray in the moonlight, as if about to leap, their growls growing louder. I was terrified to turn away from them, which in all likelihood would prompt them to launch themselves on top of us. Go away, I shouted in the most fearsome voice I could manage. Now 2 other dogs approached. I slung Deepa around, holding her collapsing form up in front of me, pain clenching my arms. Wake up, I screamed. We have to run now. Her weight was getting unbearable, and she didn't move. I turned her stiff body to face me. Wake up. Then I saw her face, without expression, mouth half open. Her eyes were also partway open, cold, dull slits in the moonlight, as uncaring as gashes in stone. She was a thing. She couldn't be my sister. The first dog jumped, landing on the corpse's back. If I didn't let the dog have it, he and all the others would tear me to shreds. I dropped it and ran. I didn't stop running until I was halfway home. Then I fell and lay face down in the middle of the road, sobbing into the dirt. All I could think of was the hollow shell of Deepa's absence, now filled only by the horrible image of her as a thing. Then another image came to me, and the shapeless fear I'd first struggled against in the charnel field finally took form. I too would someday be a thing. So would everyone I loved and everyone else, from the strongest warrior to the youngest baby. No, I shouted into the night, and the village dogs erupted in barking. Reflexively, I filled with hatred. Then I stopped. They too were going to turn into things. Why hadn't I seen anyone's spirit? Had they left the corpses to go live elsewhere? But what could spirits possibly be without bodies to give them form? I struggled to my feet and started walking, not caring if the dog clamor I'd caused woke up villagers who would drag me home to be punished. No matter if my mother locked me up in some room. With this newfound knowledge of death, it didn't matter where I ended up. The dog racket died down, followed by the tiniest puppy yelp. I jolted to a stop, remembering Deepa's spirit might be in a dog. Was it possible? That's what the wanderers were trying to find out. At that moment, the only worthwhile pursuit seemed to be this search for spirit. Under the white misshapen moon, I knelt down and promised my sister that I would find her soul so she could be with her family again and not have to travel through realms of samsara, lonely forever. As soon as I was old enough, I would go forth into homelessness and become a wanderer myself, uncovering the truth. It went without saying I would never marry. I resumed walking. Back in the charnel grounds, the moonlit feast went on and on.
Wow. That 10-year-old Yasi, we see the spirit, the courage, the love in her. So we see the development of that character that's going to carry the whole story, that whole beautiful story, the Bride of Buddha.
Well, thank you.
So
She in some ways has the same revelation that the Buddha does, the discovery of death.
yes,
Her way.
yes, she had it at 10,
Yeah.
and he came to that realization, and he had to go on his quest at 29, but it was the same thing. So the parallelism that you draw there is just beautiful. So did you have anything else that you wanted to say about the book itself? I have a question, but I don't know if you'll give me the answer.
What's
Did in the story, does the Buddha know that Yasi and Ananda are the same person?
that? You'll have to read the book to find out.
You would say that, but I thought I would ask anyway.
It's such a spoiler alert to say guys, you know.
Yeah, that. Yeah, but that's such a curious point there. So, Barbara, as a member of your writing group, I have had the great pleasure of reading your extremely beautiful prose. Sometimes when I'm reading and I'm supposed to be critiquing, I forget to critique because I just get caught up in the beautiful language, the lush descriptions, the sensory detail. You just put us so in the place. We're in that charnel ground, or the other locations that you have, we're right there. So I wanted to know, what writers, can you tell us some of the authors who have influenced you as a writer?
Well, I think the Bible and Shakespeare, and novelists from Dickens to George Eliot, Joyce Carol Oates, and also Toni Morrison as an author who deals with the paranormal and yet grounds it in physical, cultural, psychological reality. She takes human possibilities to really amazing places. And I recently reread Beloved, during the sheltering in place, and it was like, oh, it was better than I remembered. And I think she is a terrific novelist. And I'm so grateful for the women writers right now that are portraying women in myths, legends, and history who've only been seen from a masculine point of view. And now these women like Madeline Miller writing Circe, the woman, the witch who seduces Odysseus. And now we get the whole story from her point of view and her story. And another woman that I've actually worked with a little has written a book called The Passion of Mary Magdalene. And it's like The Bride of the Buddha. It's describing the founder of a world religion from the point of view of a woman, and yet making it the woman's story, not the Buddha's or Jesus's story. And there's also Barbara Quick, who's a novelist local around here, who's written a book called Vivaldi's Virgins, which I read several years ago. And it's it's a unique story from the point of view of one of Vivaldi's female elite musicians who was cloistered in a foundling home where he was the maestro and composer. And that was another fascinating view of these historical figures from something other than a male point of view or from the figure themselves. So that type of writer has really influenced me lately.
Hmm. Well, another question I have for you is, do you have a particular writing routine? I remember reading, I don't know if it's apocryphal or actual, but I read that Hemingway said that he would write 3 pages in the morning and in the afternoon he'd cut out the junk. That was his writing routine. So what is your, if
Probably
you have a writing routine?
fewer pages and more junk. And squeezing it in whenever I can. I used to think, okay, I have to sit down every morning and write, but I find now that I sort of slot it in whenever I can. I feel like I have to write every day sometime, somewhere. And it's having to do all the stuff around the book is frustrating because I'm working on another book right now. And as you know,
Yes.
so I'm trying to squeeze in the time to finish that. So I wish I had a better disciplined routine, but I just do it when I can, is sort of how it comes down after.
Well, I don't know about the discipline, but I know the writing that we see is extremely disciplined. It's lush, it's vibrant, it pulls you in, but it's very disciplined. So
Well,
whether
I have this really great critique group, that I better toe the line. And I mean, among the influences of for my writing is certainly the group, not only their criticism, but their writing. Everyone in our group, I think, are working on really fascinating and powerful books. And Max Tomlinson has published a whole slew of mysteries and cultural thrillers and really wonderful books. And your book on the Caribbean, I can't wait till it comes out, because it's another way of writing about the supernatural, which is really interesting, and really having the supernatural goddess tell us more about our own reality, whether we believe in the supernatural or not. So looking forward to it.
well, I think my book qualifies as the kind of chartreuse and hot pink cover rather than, so to let you know first straight out the gate that it's not really serious. But
humor is part of it. It's in some ways it's very serious. It's but I really it is a very funny book along with everything else. So
yeah, I don't know if Bill has it orchestrated so that we can take questions from the audience, but if you do, that would be great.
He's
Bill,
not.
would that be on gallery view, Bill?
Yes,
Yeah.
We switch to gallery view.
I'm going to gallery view. So Patty Brightman has a question.
Okay.
Hi, thank you, Barbara. I'm really interested in reading the book. It's on the way to me, and thank you for doing this. My question is, historically, did the Buddha not admit women at first, and Ananda had to talk him into it? And how long was Ananda in the Sangha before that happened? Do we know that historically, or is that only part of your story?
No, that's historically, I mean, yeah, true, or the legend, or however, because people, we really don't know how much of this is history and how much of this is legend. But historically, yes, Ananda was the one who talked the Buddha into it. I think it was about 5 years he was been in the Sangha. He hadn't been in a terribly long time. It was because
my other question may be answered when I read Looking Away, but how can you live as a man among women? I thought they had a very close-knit community and they would have seen each other bathing.
You'll have to, she works it out.
Thank you.
I'll
wait to read the book to get my answer, but thanks so much. Congratulations.
But thank you.
Hi, Barbara. I'm so excited about this. I can't wait to get my copy. I was wondering contradictions in the historical and mythical record that you had to resolve as you wrote. If there was a issue that was consistent throughout the whole historical record or the mythical record, did you stick with that, or did you take liberties with that as well?
I'm trying to think.
That's
of-
not a judgment. Obviously, you're a fiction writer. You're allowed to do what you do to make the story.
I stuck with the Dharma as it was portrayed. You know, I mean, I don't mess with what the Buddha believed and tried to pass along. So that, and sort of the basic story of him leaving his wife is also canonical, as so to speak. So, so there were stories, yeah, and then the story, some of them I just twiddled with a bit, like I did, there's a scene when Ananda goes on trial. That actually is in the scriptures. I do a little, I don't do it completely word for word, but I actually lots of times quote from the English translations for lines of dialogue. Lots of times, Devadatta, who functions as sort of a villain figure, a lot of what he says, either he actually said it or the Buddha, it's attributed to the Buddha, and Yasadhara said, no, it's not Buddha who said that, it was Devadatta. So it varies, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that is actually unmitigated. I mean, it's crafted to fit my story, but the viewpoints and the actual events, such as the Ananda talking to Buddha to accepting women, that's part of the legend.
So we have a question from Don and Diana Bartletti. So if you guys would unmute yourselves.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Question. It's probably not a good question, though. I was wondering about how these characters that you're writing about drift through your own meditations.
Drift through my own meditation.
Or, well, I just don't know how to put it, but maybe, see, I thought it maybe not a good question.
Well, it's actually when I'm not doing a good job meditating, that would be when
I guess that's why.
they do. I mean, when I was writing the book, I mean, you live with them, you live with the story, and you're walking through the woods, and the stories are working themselves out, and then, oh, this happens and that happens. So yeah, they stay with you, and sometimes they visit you in strange ways, and they insist on things you don't want to necessarily follow them to do, but you compromise or you work it out.
I guess that's what okay, thanks.
Good to see you.
So we have a question from Max Tomlinson.
Hey, Barbara. First of all, congratulations on publishing the book. I got my copy. It looks beautiful.
Thank you, Matt.
Can you hear me?
All your help.
Oh. A question I have is something that never crossed my mind before. I think at reading this, one of the many things that impresses me so much about it is how accessible the story is to people who know nothing about Buddhism. I think that's really wondering how much of that was deliberate or how much of it just came out through storytelling, wanting to tell a story that reached a lot of people.
I'm not sure what you mean. I
mean, in terms of the audience, I mean, I think one of the things that really grabs me about this book is that I can read it and pretty much follow a lot of the Buddhist lore without knowing a great deal about it. And I think that's really that's pretty remarkable to be able to pull that off. And I just wondered, was that deliberate or did it just happen that way? Or
I did want to reach beyond Buddhists. I really was interested. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is, well, what do you want people to get out of this book? And I'd love to introduce people to the Dharma and to Buddhism. And so I wanted to make it accessible to people other than Buddhists. And also just in working out my own problems, I had to make it, accessible to my non-Buddhist self in a way. I mean, so does that answer your question? I think he's frozen.
Frozen is that I think she put a lot of effort into making the story accessible to those of us who know nothing about Buddhism. And I thought I thought that was very deliberate on her part.
okay. I think it's good. It's great. I mean, Kate, my wife, is reading it now, and she's like just able to really enjoying it. And so
Okay, Barbara, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. That was weird. Sort
Okay.
of like suddenly being thrown out of the boat.
Yeah, you just froze.
I know our
Yeah.
screen went blank, and we got all kinds of little messages, and it was definitely not something that you like to have happen. So anyone else have a question? Charles.
We got the book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I just wanted to compliment you on the richness of that, all of it, but the paragraph, the passage you read about being in the I don't know, it's a charnel house, a graveyard. It was so rich in the detail, and the sense almost felt like part of me felt like I was there, and being taken in to feel that way is to me a sign of wonderful writing. And I really congratulate you on that, and I look forward to reading it.
Thanks. Oh, it's funny.
Well, I can assure you that the whole book is like that.
I'm sure it
is sort of funny. Oh, I felt it was so great. I felt I was in the charnel ground. But yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I'll feel at midnight tonight, but
Judy's got a
might not be bedtime reading.
Okay. Oh, I put a comment in the chat. My copy arrived yesterday, and I'm halfway through. I just can't put it down. And as Charles said, it's so wonderfully and richly detailed. I definitely feel I'm on the journey with Yasi. And I also appreciate how your own spirituality and deep faith inform and weave its way through the characters. The characters are so amazingly deeply developed. And I don't know that much about Buddhism either, but I'm on the road with Yasi, about ready to, on my way to the monastery. So thank you, Barbara.
Oh, well, thank you.
We have a question from Stanley Bogosian.
Barbara, following up on a previous question, is there any character in the story or any aspect of that history that now that you've written the book that you feel like you'd write another book about, or that you'd like to follow up on or really dig into more? Either a character or an aspect of the history.
I'm not, it's funny. I'm right now so involved in this other work that I'm doing. There are times I think, oh yeah, there's that world. I want to go back to it. That world of 500 BC, 300, 400 BC. But I'm not sure. I mean, what I think I don't have a specific character I want to follow up about. Like, oh, do I want to write a book about whatever happened to Stick Woman? And I haven't. Although I probably would write about those people if anyone, but I'm not sure. Interested. Now I'll think about it now that you've raised the issue.
Well, I've heard that before. An author is their chief concern is their present work, and what's past is past. So. Yeah,
there is some of that. Although, when you're working on a book, I've had to re-immerse myself in the book. But it's the publication process is a lengthy process. And then, of course, we had the sheltering in place, and the publication was put off, and the election, and
Thanks.
So I think we're really, we've gone over time. So I just want to ask Barbara and Dot if they have anything else they'd like to say before we wrap things up.
Well, I'd like to just thank everybody for coming and for sitting around and listening. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the comments, and thank you very much for buying the book. And I hope everybody enjoys reading it. You know, that's why I wrote it. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we'd like to encourage everyone to take a look at Barbara's website. It's barbaramchugh.com. She has a lot more, she has many more events coming up, as well as podcasts and other things that are going to be appearing over the next couple of weeks. So,
Right.
and she has a mailing list there,
Right.
so you can stay up to date if you like.
People might be interested, because I'm having a long conversation with the woman who wrote The Passion of Mary Magdalene. And we're going to talk more deeply into the issues of how to write about a major world religion founder, and how dare you be so presumptuous. And so that might be fun. I also want to add another shout out to my writing group. Thank you guys. You're so wonderful. And soon I will be at your readings. I have been at Max's readings.
Right.
And Dot.
Okay. I'm on notice.
And thanks to Dot for being with us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Dot, so much. I've so much.
Oh, you are so welcome. My pleasure.
I only wish I had wine and cheese and whatever you want to hand out now. Alas.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. We'd like to thank Book Passage for sponsoring this event. Please visit Barbara's website, barbaramchugh.com, for more information about events coming up. You can join her email list, and there are various other bonuses there. So once again, thanks for attending. Good night.